The winter wind howled against the frost-etched windows of Ashworth Manor, but inside the small drawing room, the cold had nothing to do with the weather. Eleanor Hartwell sat perfectly still in a threadbare chair, her hands folded in her lap with a composure that had taken 24 years to perfect, and listened to the Dowager Duchess of Pemberton make an offer that sounded utterly, impossibly mad. "One evening," the Dowager Duchess repeated, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to having her smallest whim obeyed. "One Christmas ball. You need only pretend to be engaged to my son for a few hours, Miss Hartwell. Smile at his side, accept congratulations, play the role of a woman in love. In exchange, I will settle your father's debts in full and provide an annual income sufficient to restore Ashworth Manor to its former glory." Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs, but her face remained serene. She had learned long ago not to show weakness, not to let the world see how desperately the Hartwell family teetered on the edge of complete ruin. Her father's investments had failed 3 years ago. Her mother had died 2 years past, worn down by worry and deprivation. Her younger sister, Beatrice, deserved a season, a chance at happiness, but there was no money for new gowns, no funds for a London townhouse, barely enough to keep the roof from leaking. And now this woman, this powerful, calculating woman, was offering salvation in exchange for a single evening of deception. "Your Grace," Eleanor said carefully, her voice steady despite the chaos in her mind, "I am honored by your confidence in my abilities. But surely your son, the Duke of Pemberton, would have some objection to a false engagement being announced in his name." The Dowager Duchess's lips curved into a smile that held no warmth, only satisfaction. She was perhaps 60 years of age, elegantly dressed in dark blue silk that whispered of wealth with every movement, her silver hair arranged in an elaborate coiffure that must have taken hours. Diamonds glittered at her throat and ears, each stone probably worth more than everything the Hartwells still possessed. "My son," she said with careful emphasis, "has spent the past 5 years avoiding every attempt I have made to see him settled. He is 31 years old, Miss Hartwell. 31, wealthy beyond measure, possessed of a title that opens every door in England, and he treats matrimony as though it were a disease to be avoided at all costs." "Perhaps he simply hasn't found the right woman," Eleanor suggested, though she knew nothing of the Duke of Pemberton beyond his reputation. Cold, they said, dutiful to his estates and his seat in Parliament, but utterly disinterested in society's pleasures. She had never even seen him, as the Hartwells moved in circles far below ducal notice. "He has found no woman because he refuses to look," the Dowager Duchess said sharply. "After his disappointment 5 years ago, he closed himself off completely. He buried himself in account books and political debates and convinced himself that emotion is weakness, that love is liability. It is unnatural, Miss Hartwell, unhealthy. He needs to be reminded that he is human, that life offers more than cold duty." Eleanor felt a flicker of sympathy for this unknown duke, trapped by his mother's schemes. Then she remembered Beatrice's face when they'd sold their mother's pearls last month, the shame and sadness her sister tried so hard to hide, and the sympathy faded. "What exactly would this arrangement entail?" she asked. The Dowager Duchess leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with triumph at Eleanor's tacit agreement. "The Christmas ball at Pemberton House is in 3 days' time. It is the event of the season, attended by everyone of consequence. You will arrive as my personal guest. I will introduce you to society as my son intended, announce that you have been secretly engaged for some months, and that we are revealing it now to celebrate the season. You will stand at his side, accept congratulations, dance with him, play the devoted fiancé. After the ball concludes, you may end the engagement quietly. Mutual decision, no scandal, no harm done. And you will have your money. And your son," Eleanor pressed. "When does he learn of this arrangement? Surely he must be informed beforehand." Something flickered across the Dowager Duchess's face, too quick to identify. "My son will understand the necessity once it is done. He is a practical man, Miss Hartwell. He will recognize that a brief, false engagement is a small price to pay to satisfy society's expectations and secure his mother's peace of mind. It was an evasion, Eleanor realized with growing unease. The Dowager Duchess had no intention of telling her son beforehand. This would be a complete surprise to him, a public ambush from which he could not escape without creating scandal. "Your Grace," Eleanor said slowly, "you're not going to tell him at all, are you? I will be introduced as his fiancée, and he will know nothing of it until that very moment." The Dowager Duchess's expression hardened. "My son is stubborn, Miss Hartwell. If I inform him beforehand, he will refuse, forbid it, possibly even absent himself from his own Christmas ball to avoid the situation. But if society believes the engagement is real, if 300 guests witness the announcement, he will be trapped by honor and propriety. He will maintain the fiction rather than create scandal, and perhaps, just perhaps, he will realize that the world has not ended because he has a woman at his side." "This is madness," Eleanor whispered. "This is a necessity," the Dowager Duchess corrected. "For both of us. You need money desperately enough to be sitting here listening to my mad proposal. I need my son to remember he is human before he calculates and manages himself into an early grave. We can help each other, Miss Hartwell. One evening of deception in exchange for your family's future. Is that truly such a terrible bargain?" Eleanor thought of her father, growing grayer and more stooped with each passing month under the weight of debts he could never repay. She thought of Beatrice, 17 and lovely and deserving of so much more than a life of genteel poverty. She thought of Ashworth Manor, the home her family had held for 200 years, slowly crumbling around them. One evening, a few hours of playing a role. Surely she could manage that. "Very well," Eleanor heard herself say. "I agree to your terms, Your Grace. But I want the agreement in writing. The amount you will pay, the timeline, all of it documented and signed." "Shrewd," the Dowager Duchess said approvingly. "Yes, Miss Hartwell, you will have your contract. My secretary will draw it up immediately. Now we must discuss your preparation. You cannot appear at Pemberton House in—" She gestured vaguely at Eleanor's worn morning dress. "That you will need appropriate gowns, jewels, and coaching on how to conduct yourself as a duchess-to-be. Fortunately, we have 3 days." The next 72 hours passed in a blur of activity that left Eleanor's head spinning. The Dowager Duchess installed her in a suite at the Pemberton townhouse in London, a residence so vast and opulent that Eleanor felt lost in its marble corridors. A modiste arrived with assistants and what seemed like entire warehouses of fabric, creating gowns in record time while clucking disapprovingly about the rushed schedule. "For the ball, we need something that will make an impression," the modiste declared, draping Eleanor in silver silk that shimmered like moonlight. "Something that announces her as worthy of a duke's notice." "Yes, this will do beautifully." Eleanor stood on the fitting platform, watching her reflection transform in the mirrors. The gown was exquisite, far finer than anything she had ever worn. It made her chestnut hair appear richer, her blue-gray eyes more luminous, her figure elegant rather than merely slender from too many missed meals. "You look like a duchess already," the Dowager Duchess's lady's maid, Mrs. Thornbury, said approvingly. "His Grace will be most surprising." Surprised was certainly one word for it, Eleanor thought grimly. Furious might be more accurate. She had tried, in the whirlwind of preparations, to learn more about the Duke of Pemberton. The servants were carefully uninformative, speaking of His Grace with the kind of respect that could mean either deep loyalty or deep fear. The picture that emerged was of a man who was brilliant, demanding, utterly controlled. He managed his vast estates with precision, spoke in Parliament with authority, moved through society with perfect courtesy and complete emotional detachment. "He was different before," Mrs. Thornbury had said quietly while arranging Eleanor's hair. "Before Lady Caroline. Warmer." He smiled then, laughed even. But after she jilted him for Lord Ashford, after the scandal, something in him changed, hardened. The Dowager Duchess worries, though she'd never say so directly. A man shouldn't live like he does, all duty and no joy. Now, on the evening of the Christmas ball, Eleanor stood in her borrowed chamber and examined her reflection with a mixture of pride and dread. The silver gown fit perfectly, making her look like something from a fairy story. Her hair was arranged in an elaborate style threaded with tiny diamonds that the Dowager Duchess had insisted she wear. She looked, Eleanor had to admit, like someone who might plausibly be engaged to a duke. She looked like a beautiful lie. A knock at the door preceded the Dowager Duchess's entrance. The older woman swept into the room, resplendent in deep purple silk, her own diamonds blazing. "Perfect," she pronounced, circling Eleanor with an assessing eye. "You look every inch a future duchess. Now, remember what we discussed. You are deeply in love with my son. You have been engaged for 3 months, kept secret to allow you time to know each other away from society's scrutiny. You met at a house party in the autumn. The proposal was romantic but private. You are deliriously happy but appropriately modest about it. Can you manage that? I am an impoverished gentlewoman selling my dignity for money, Your Grace," Eleanor said with more sharpness than was probably wise. "I believe I can manage a few hours of acting." The Dowager Duchess's expression softened slightly. "You are a young woman saving her family from ruin, Miss Hartwell. There is no shame in that. And who knows? Perhaps this farce will become something more. Perhaps you and Alexander will actually suit. Your Grace, I haven't even met your son. This entire situation is built on deception. Nothing real could ever grow from such poisoned soil." "We shall see," the Dowager Duchess said enigmatically. "Come, it is time." The ballroom of Pemberton House was a vision of Christmas splendor. Evergreen boughs adorned with red ribbons and gold ornaments decorated every available surface. Candles blazed in crystal chandeliers and wall sconces, making the room glow with warmth. A massive Christmas tree, decorated in the German fashion that had become popular, dominated one corner. The air smelled of pine and cinnamon and the expensive perfumes of London's elite. Eleanor entered on the Dowager Duchess's arm, her heart hammering so violently she feared it might actually escape her chest. The ballroom was already crowded with guests, hundreds of people in their finest evening dress, talking and laughing and dancing. She recognized no one, moved in circles so far above her normal sphere that these people might as well have been foreign royalty. "Courage," the Dowager Duchess murmured. "You look magnificent. Trust me." Eleanor didn't trust her at all, but it was far too late to retreat now. They moved through the crowd, the Dowager Duchess accepting greetings and compliments with practiced grace. Eleanor smiled and nodded, trying to look like someone who belonged in such company rather than an impostor in borrowed finery. Then she saw him. He stood near the fireplace in conversation with several gentlemen, and Eleanor knew instantly that this was Alexander Winters, Duke of Pemberton. He was tall, perhaps 6 feet, with dark hair and strong, aristocratic features. He wore his evening dress with the kind of unconscious elegance that spoke of breeding and wealth. But it was his eyes that struck her most powerfully, gray-green and intelligent, scanning his guests with a detachment that suggested he was performing a duty rather than enjoying a celebration. He was handsome, devastatingly so, but there was something cold about him, something closed off and unreachable. This was a man who had learned not to feel, who had armored himself against the world. This was the man she was about to trap in a false engagement. "Come," the Dowager Duchess said, steering Eleanor toward him. "Time to meet your future husband." They approached the Duke's group, and Eleanor watched his mother's expression transform into warmth and delight, a perfect performance of maternal joy. "Alexander, darling," the Dowager Duchess called, her voice carrying across the conversation. "I have someone very special I wish you to meet." The Duke turned, his expression polite but distant. His eyes swept over Eleanor with the kind of assessment one might give a new piece of furniture, cataloging and dismissing in the same moment. "Mother," he said, his voice deep and carefully modulated, "you seem in unusually high spirits this evening." "As well I should be," the Dowager Duchess said, and Eleanor heard the steel beneath the sweetness. "Ladies and gentlemen, would you permit me to make an announcement that will, I hope, bring great joy to this Christmas celebration?" The conversation around them began to dim, other guests noticing that something significant was happening, turning to observe. Eleanor felt her mouth go dry, felt her carefully rehearsed composure beginning to crack. The Duke's eyes narrowed slightly, some instinct warning him that something was amiss. "Mother," he said quietly, a note of warning in his tone. "What are you doing?" "Why, sharing our wonderful news, of course," the Dowager Duchess said, raising her voice to carry across the increasingly silent ballroom. "My dear friends, I am delighted to announce the engagement of my son, Alexander, Duke of Pemberton, to Miss Eleanor Hartwell. They have been secretly engaged these past 3 months, and we reveal it now to celebrate this blessed season. Please join me in congratulating the happy couple." The ballroom erupted into shocked exclamations and enthusiastic applause. People surged forward, eager to offer congratulations and examine this mystery woman who had captured the uncapturable Duke. But Eleanor barely heard the commotion. All her attention was fixed on the Duke's face, watching understanding and fury dawn in those gray-green eyes as he realized what his mother had done. He looked at Eleanor, really looked at her for the first time, and his expression was absolutely arctic. "Miss Hartwell," he said, his voice soft and deadly. "How unexpected. I don't believe we've been introduced." "Your Grace," Eleanor managed, her voice remarkably steady despite the terror coursing through her. That is." "Yes," the Duke said, his smile not reaching his eyes as guests pressed closer. "Perhaps you could explain to me exactly when this engagement occurred, as I seem to have no recollection of it whatsoever." The Dowager Duchess's hand clamped on Eleanor's arm like a vice, holding her in place as surely as iron shackles. "Now, Alexander," she said brightly, though her eyes held a warning. "Don't be difficult. We can discuss the details later. For now, smile and accept congratulations. Don't make a scene at your own Christmas ball." The Duke's jaw clenched, a muscle jumping in his cheek. Eleanor watched him wrestle with his options, and saw the moment he realized he was trapped. To denounce the engagement now, before 300 witnesses, would create the kind of scandal that would follow both him and Eleanor for years. His mother had chosen her moment perfectly. "Of course," he said finally, his voice like ice over stone. "How could I possibly make a scene when my mother has orchestrated such a delightful surprise?" He offered his arm to Eleanor with mechanical courtesy. She took it, feeling the rigid tension in his muscles, the fury he was barely containing. "Smile," he murmured as guests descended upon them with congratulations. "You wanted this, didn't you? This moment of glory? Playing Duchess for an evening? Then by all means, enjoy it while it lasts, because the moment this ball ends, Miss Hartwell, you and I are going to have a very frank discussion about the nature of deception and its consequences." Eleanor forced her lips into a smile, accepted congratulations from people whose names she didn't know, and felt her heart sink with the certainty that she had just made the worst mistake of her life. The Duke of Pemberton was not a man who forgave easily, and she had just helped trap him in a lie before all of London society. The next 2 hours were the longest of Eleanor's life. She stood at the Duke's side, her hand resting on his arm, feeling the tension radiating from him like heat from a forge. He smiled and accepted congratulations with perfect courtesy, played the role of delighted bridegroom with a skill that would have impressed the finest actor at Drury Lane. But Eleanor felt the fury beneath the performance, the cold rage that he kept locked behind impeccable manners. "How long have you known each other?" Lady Thornbury asked, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Not nearly as long as I believed," the Duke said smoothly before Eleanor could answer. "Miss Hartwell continues to surprise me with revelations about our relationship." "Don't you, my dear?" The endearment sounded like a threat. "You are too modest, Your Grace," Eleanor managed, trying to remember her rehearsed story. "We met at Lady Ashworth's house party in September. His Grace was kind enough to engage me in conversation about estate management, a subject I find endlessly fascinating." "Estate management," the Duke repeated, his tone making it clear he didn't believe a word. "How remarkably specific. And when, precisely, did I propose? I confess the memory escapes me. Perhaps you could refresh my recollection." "It was during the morning walk through the gardens," Eleanor said, her mind racing. "You said, That is, you asked. I asked if you would do me the honor of becoming my wife. The Duke finished for her, his voice deadly quiet. How romantic. How utterly memorable. Strange that I have no recollection of it whatsoever. Lady Thornberry looked between them uncertainly, sensing undercurrents she didn't understand. Alexander was quite overcome with emotion. The Dowager Duchess interjected smoothly, appearing at Eleanor's other side like a general reinforcing a faltering position. He's never been particularly demonstrative, but I assure you, his devotion to Miss Hartwell is quite genuine. Isn't it, darling? Oh, undoubtedly, the Duke said. My devotion is beyond question, as is my mother's talent for creative storytelling. Before the conversation could deteriorate further, the orchestra began playing a waltz. The Duke bowed with rigid formality. Miss Hartwell, would you do me the honor of dancing? I believe it's expected of an engaged couple. It wasn't a request. Eleanor placed her hand in his, allowing him to lead her onto the dance floor. The moment they were in position, his hand at her waist, hers on his shoulder, she felt the full force of his controlled fury. I don't know what arrangement you made with my mother, he said quietly as they began to move, his voice pitched for her ears alone. But you have made a catastrophic error in judgment, Miss Hartwell. I am not a man who tolerates manipulation. I never intended, Eleanor began. Don't lie, he cut her off sharply. You agreed to this farce. You accepted whatever payment my mother offered to play the role of my devoted fiancé. What I want to know is why. What could possibly induce a woman I have never met to participate in such elaborate deception? Eleanor met his eyes, seeing the cold intelligence there, the anger, but also something else. Hurt, perhaps. Betrayal. This was a man who had been wounded before, who had learned not to trust, and she had just confirmed every cynical belief he held about human nature. My family is ruined, she said quietly, deciding that after everything else, she at least owed him honesty. My father's debts are crushing us. Your mother offered to settle them in exchange for one evening of pretense. I agreed because I am desperate, Your Grace, and desperate people make poor decisions. He studied her face, searching for deception, finding only exhausted truth. You sold yourself for money, he said flatly. I saved my family from destruction, Eleanor corrected. There is a difference. Is there? The Duke's expression was unreadable. It seems to me you have merely traded one form of bondage for another. Did my mother promise this would end after the ball? That you would walk away with your payment and no further obligation? Yes, Eleanor said, though doubt was beginning to creep into her mind. She said we could end the engagement quietly afterward. The Duke laughed, a bitter sound without humor. And you believed her. How remarkably naive. My mother has no intention of letting this end quickly. She has trapped us both, Miss Hartwell. Society has witnessed our engagement. To dissolve it now would create a scandal that would follow both of us for years. You would be marked as the woman rejected by a duke. I would be seen as either cruel or unstable. Neither of us can escape without damage. Eleanor felt ice spreading through her chest. But surely there's some way. There is no way, the Duke said grimly. We are trapped together, you and I, bound by my mother's schemes and society's expectations. The question now is what we do about it. What do you want to do? Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The Duke was silent for a long moment, his eyes never leaving her face as they moved through the waltz's patterns. I want, he said finally, to know the woman who agreed to trap me. If we are to be bound together in this fiction, I should at least understand my supposed beloved. Tell me, Miss Hartwell, are you always so willing to sacrifice your integrity for financial gain? The words stung as they were intended to. Eleanor felt her own anger rising to meet him. Are you always so quick to judge those whose circumstances you know nothing about? She countered. It's easy to maintain your precious integrity when you've never known real desperation, when you've never watched your family suffer while being powerless to help them. I made a choice, Your Grace, perhaps not a wise one, but it was mine to make. And I will not apologize for trying to save the people I love. Something flickered in the Duke's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, at her willingness to challenge him. "You have spirit," he observed. "I'll grant you that. Most women would be weeping or making excuses." "I am not most women," Eleanor said. "And I am too tired for tears, Your Grace. I have spent 3 years watching my family's world crumble. I have sold my mother's jewels piece by piece, dismissed servants I've known since childhood, worn gowns turned and mended until the fabric was more patched than original. When your mother offered me a way to end that suffering, I took it. Judge me if you must, but know that I would make the same choice again." The music ended. They stood together in the center of the ballroom, other couples moving past them, but Eleanor barely noticed. She was caught in the Duke's gaze, in the complicated mix of anger and unwilling understanding she saw there. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "We will continue this conversation later, in private. For now, we must maintain the charade. My mother has won this battle, but the war is far from finished." The rest of the evening passed in a haze. Eleanor smiled and accepted congratulations from dozens of people whose faces blurred together. She made small talk about wedding plans that didn't exist with women who eyed her with envy or calculation. She allowed the Duke to remain at her side, the perfect attentive fiancé, while feeling the coiled tension in him like a spring wound too tight. Finally, mercifully, the clock struck midnight and guests began to depart. Eleanor felt exhaustion crashing over her, the adrenaline that had sustained her through the evening draining away and leaving her hollow. "Miss Hartwell," the Duke said, his voice formal and cold, "if you would join my mother and myself in my study. There are matters we must discuss." It wasn't a request. Eleanor followed him through Pemberton House's corridors, acutely aware of the Dowager Duchess trailing behind them. The Duke's study was a masculine room, all dark wood and leather, books lining the walls and a fire burning in the grate. He closed the door with precise care, then turned to face them both. "Would one of you care to explain," he said with dangerous quiet, "what you thought you were accomplishing with tonight's performance?" The Dowager Duchess drew herself up to her full height, meeting her son's fury with calm determination. "I was accomplishing what needed to be done, Alexander. You have spent 5 years in self-imposed isolation, convincing yourself that duty is enough, that you need nothing beyond your estates and your parliamentary work. You are killing yourself slowly, and I refuse to watch it continue. So you decided to trap me in a false engagement?" The Duke's voice rose slightly. "To humiliate me before all of society by attaching me to a woman I've never met? I decided to remind you that you are human," the Dowager Duchess said sharply. "That life offers more than cold calculation and emotional detachment." Miss Hartwell agreed to help me. Yes, she had her reasons, but she also showed courage in accepting such an unusual arrangement. "The least you can do is treat her with the respect she deserves rather than directing all your anger at the easiest target." The Duke's eyes snapped to Eleanor. "Is that what you want? My respect? Very well. I respect your desperation. I respect your willingness to sacrifice your dignity for your family's survival. I do not respect the deception, no matter how noble the motivation." "I never asked for your respect, Your Grace," Eleanor said wearily. "I asked for nothing from you at all. This entire situation was your mother's design. I am merely the tool she used to execute it. If you want to rage at someone, rage at her. I am too tired to care." Silence fell, broken only by the crackle of the fire. The Duke stared at her, some of the fury fading from his expression, replaced by something that might have been unwilling acknowledgement. "You're exhausted," he said finally, his tone marginally less harsh. "And this conversation is accomplishing nothing productive. Mother, you will show Miss Hartwell to the Blue Suite. She can hardly return home tonight without raising questions. Tomorrow, all 3 of us will discuss how to manage this disaster you've created." "I can return home," Eleanor protested. "I don't need." "You are now my supposed fiancé," the Duke interrupted. "As such, your reputation is tied to mine. You will stay in this house, properly chaperoned, and we will determine our next course of action together." Consider it one of the many consequences of the choice you made this evening." He turned away, dismissing them both, his shoulders rigid with tension. Eleanor followed the Dowager Duchess out of the study, her mind churning with everything that had happened, everything that had gone so catastrophically wrong. "He'll come around," the Dowager Duchess said quietly as they climbed the grand staircase. "Alexander's anger burns hot but briefly. By tomorrow, he'll be thinking practically rather than emotionally." "I hope you're right, Your Grace," Eleanor said, "because I think I've just made an enemy of the one man whose goodwill I actually need." That night, lying in a bed more comfortable than any she'd slept in for years, Eleanor stared at the ceiling and wondered how a simple agreement to play a role for one evening had transformed into something so much more complicated, so much more dangerous than she had ever imagined. Eleanor woke the next morning to weak winter sunlight filtering through heavy curtains and the sound of rain pattering against the windows. For a moment, she forgot where she was, forgot the disaster of the previous evening. Then memory crashed over her like a cold wave, and she groaned, burying her face in the pillow. She had agreed to a false engagement with a duke she'd never met. She had stood before 300 guests and accepted congratulations for a lie. She had watched fury and betrayal flash in gray-green eyes, and felt the weight of his anger like a physical thing. What had she done? A knock at the door preceded a maid entering with a breakfast tray and the news that the Duke and his mother expected Eleanor to join them in the morning room at 10 o'clock. Eleanor bathed and dressed in one of the new morning gowns the Dowager Duchess had provided, soft blue muslin that made her look deceptively demure. She arranged her hair simply, forgoing the elaborate style from the ball. If she was going to face the Duke's wrath, she would do it as herself, not as the glittering fantasy his mother had created. The morning room was bright despite the gray weather, decorated in shades of cream and gold. The Duke stood by the window, staring out at the rain-soaked garden. He turned as Eleanor entered, and she was struck again by how handsome he was, and how completely closed off. He had rebuilt his walls overnight, his expression giving nothing away. "Miss Hartwell," he said with cold courtesy, "please sit. We have much to discuss." The Dowager Duchess was already seated at the small table, pouring tea with serene confidence. Eleanor took the remaining chair, feeling like a prisoner before a tribunal. "I have spent the night considering our options," the Duke began without preamble. "There are several possible courses of action. First, we could publicly denounce the engagement immediately, claim it was a misunderstanding, and accept the scandal that would follow. You would be marked as the woman who falsely claimed an engagement with a duke. I would be seen as either a cad who led you on or a fool who was easily deceived. Neither scenario is appealing." "Second option?" Eleanor asked, her voice steady despite her anxiety. "We continue the engagement for a brief period, say 6 weeks, then end it quietly with the claim that we did not suit after all. This would still create gossip, but less explosive than an immediate retraction. You would be viewed with some pity, but not as a schemer. I would be seen as practical rather than cruel." "And the third option?" the Dowager Duchess prompted. The Duke's jaw tightened. "We make the engagement real, actually marry, transform mother's fiction into fact." Eleanor's teacup rattled against its saucer. "You cannot be serious." "I am entirely serious," the Duke said, "though not enthusiastic. However, it is the only option that creates no scandal, that protects both our reputations completely. You would get your family's debts settled and secure your sister's future beyond anything mother promised. I would satisfy society's expectations and give my mother what she claims to want, seeing me settled." "But you would be married to a complete stranger," Eleanor protested. "Someone you don't love, don't even know. How could that possibly be preferable to a few weeks of gossip?" The Duke's expression was utterly cold. "I don't believe in love, Miss Hartwell. My mother may have told you otherwise, may have painted some romantic picture of a wounded man waiting to be healed by the right woman. I assure you that's fiction. I believe in duty, obligation, and appropriate alliances. Love is an illusion people use to justify their desires. If I must marry eventually, which society demands, One woman is much the same as another as long as she is suitable. The words were brutal in their honesty. Eleanor saw the Dowager Duchess flinch, saw pain flash across her face before she smoothed it away. "Alexander," his mother said quietly. "You don't mean that." "I mean every word," he said. 5 years ago, I believed in love. I believed Caroline when she said she adored me, when she accepted my proposal, when she swore she wanted nothing more than to be my wife. Then Lord Ashford offered her a title she preferred and deeper pockets, and she broke our engagement without a backward glance. I learned my lesson, Mother. Love is a transaction dressed up in pretty words. At least this arrangement with Miss Hartwell is honestly dishonest. We both know exactly what this is. A business arrangement, no romantic illusions required. Eleanor felt something twist in her chest. Pity, perhaps, for this man who had armed himself so completely against feeling that he couldn't recognize how much pain still lived in him. "I won't marry you," she said quietly. The Duke's eyebrows rose. Won't, Eleanor confirmed. "Not under these conditions. Not when you view marriage as simply another duty to be discharged. My family may be ruined, Your Grace, but I still have some standards. I will not spend my life bound to a man who sees me as interchangeable with any other suitable female." "How noble," the Duke said dryly, "and how remarkably impractical. What exactly is your alternative plan, Miss Hartwell? We have 3 options, none of them ideal. If you reject the third, you must choose between the first 2, both of which will damage you far more than me." He was right, Eleanor realized with sinking certainty. She had no good choices here. Only degrees of disaster. "The second option," she said. 6 weeks, then a quiet dissolution. I can bear 6 weeks of pretense." "Can you?" The Duke moved closer, his eyes intent on her face. 6 weeks of standing by my side at social functions. 6 weeks of accepting congratulations and planning a wedding that will never happen. 6 weeks of lying to everyone you meet. Are you truly prepared for that? Are you? Eleanor countered. "You speak of duty and obligation, but you'll have to play the devoted fiancé convincingly. You'll have to touch me, dance with me, look at me as though I matter. Can you manage that much deception, Your Grace? Or is your emotional range too limited?" The Duke's eyes narrowed. "I can play whatever role is required." "Then we agreed," Eleanor said. 6 weeks. After Christmas into January. Then we part ways with mutual civility and no scandal." "There will be scandal regardless," the Dowager Duchess interjected. "A broken engagement always creates talk, no matter how carefully managed." "Less talk than the alternatives," Eleanor said. "And I'll survive it. I've survived worse." The Duke studied her for a long moment, something like reluctant respect flickering in his expression. "Very well," he said finally. 6 weeks. But understand this, Miss Hartwell. During that time, we will need to be seen together regularly. You will attend Christmas events with me, family gatherings, and social functions. You will need to remain in London, in this house, to maintain the illusion. Are you prepared for that? Eleanor thought of Ashworth Manor, her father and sister. She'd need to write to them, explain this extended absence somehow. "I'll need to visit my family," she said. "Explain this situation, or some version of it." "Fine. Tomorrow, I'll send you in one of my carriages with appropriate escort. You may have 1 day with your family. Then you return here and we begin this performance in earnest." It was more of a concession than Eleanor had expected. She nodded, accepting the terms. "There's one more matter," the Duke said. "If we're to convince anyone this engagement is real, we need to at least know basic facts about each other. We should spend time together, learn each other's histories, preferences, and habits. People will expect us to be familiar." "You want to actually get to know me?" Eleanor couldn't keep the surprise from her voice. "I want to make this deception effective," the Duke corrected. "That requires information. Consider it research, nothing more." "Of course," Eleanor said, ignoring the sting of his coldness. "Research? How romantic." "I told you," the Duke said. "I don't do romance. I do practicality." The sooner you accept that, the easier these 6 weeks will be for both of us. The following weeks developed a strange routine. Eleanor spent her days at Pemberton House, learning the rhythms of ducal life. The Duke kept his word about spending time with her, but he approached it with the enthusiasm of someone completing an unpleasant task. They took morning walks in the garden, sat together in the library, shared meals, all while maintaining emotional distance that felt like a wall between them. "Tell me about your family," he said one afternoon as they sat in the library. Rain drummed against the windows, making the fire's warmth doubly welcome. "My father is the 5th Baron Hartwell," Eleanor replied. "A good man but an unfortunate investor. He trusted the wrong people and lost nearly everything. My mother died 2 years ago. I think the worry wore her down. My sister Beatrice is 17, lovely and sweet and deserving of better than what we can provide." "And you?" the Duke asked. "What are you like when you're not playing the role of desperate daughter?" Eleanor considered the question. "I don't know anymore. I've been desperate for so long that I've forgotten who I was before. I used to paint. I was rather good at it. I used to laugh more. I used to believe in—" She trailed off. "In what?" "In love," Eleanor admitted. "In happy endings. In the idea that two people could build something real together. I suppose we've both learned better." The Duke was quiet for a moment. "Caroline taught me that love is performance," he said finally. "She played her role beautifully, said all the right things, looked at me the right way. And all the while she was calculating, waiting for a better offer. When Ashford made his move, she discarded me like last season's fashion. So yes, Miss Hartwell, I learned better. Just as you did." "We're quite a pair," Eleanor said with dark humor. "Two cynics pretending to be in love." "At least we understand each other," the Duke replied. "That's more than most engaged couples can claim." But as the days passed, something unexpected began to happen. Eleanor found herself noticing things about the Duke that didn't fit her initial impression of him. He was cold, yes, but not cruel. He kept his distance, but he was unfailingly polite to servants, generous to tenants, devoted to his duties. She saw him reviewing accounts late into the night, saw the care he took with letters from estate managers, saw his exhaustion when he returned from Parliament debates. He was lonely, she realized, desperately, profoundly lonely. He had walled himself off so completely that no one could reach him, and he was slowly suffocating in his isolation. One evening, Eleanor found him in the music room, standing by the piano with an expression of such bleakness that it stopped her in the doorway. "Your Grace," she said softly, "is something wrong?" He looked up, seeming surprised to see her. "My mother used to play," he said, "before my father died. She would play for hours, filling this house with music. After he passed, she stopped. Said the music reminded her too much of what she'd lost. I've sometimes wondered if that's what I'm doing. Stopping everything that reminds me I once felt differently." It was the first truly vulnerable thing he'd said to her. Eleanor moved into the room slowly, as one might approach a skittish horse. "Do you want to feel differently?" she asked. The Duke laughed, but it was a hollow sound. "Want has nothing to do with it. I can't afford to feel differently. The moment I let my guard down, the moment I allow someone close, I become vulnerable again. And vulnerability leads to pain. I won't be weak again, Miss Hartwell." "Feeling isn't a weakness," Eleanor said quietly. "Caring isn't a weakness. Tell me that when someone you love chooses someone else," the Duke said bitterly. "Tell me that when the woman you were prepared to build a life with looks you in the eye and says you were only ever a means to an end. Caroline said she found my devotion tedious, that I was too serious, too intense, too much. So I learned to be less, to feel less, and it's safer this way." Eleanor's heart ached for him, for the man he'd been and the fortress he'd built around what remained. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm sorry she hurt you. I'm sorry my participation in your mother's scheme has made things worse. I'm sorry you feel you have to protect yourself so completely." The Duke looked at her, really looked at her, and something shifted in his expression. "You're very different from Caroline," he observed. "She would have used that confession against me, found some way to exploit the weakness. You simply apologize. I'm not Caroline, Eleanor said. And for what it's worth, Your Grace, I think the man you were before, the one who felt deeply, who loved intensely, he wasn't weak. He was brave. It takes more courage to love than to hide. Perhaps, the Duke said. Or perhaps I was simply a fool who didn't recognize a performance when he saw one. He left her standing in the music room, but something had changed between them. Some small wall had cracked. Christmas was approaching rapidly. The house was filled with preparations, holly and ivy, ribbons and candles, the sense of baking and pine. The Dowager Duchess threw herself into preparations with determined joy, and Eleanor helped despite the strangeness of celebrating in this grand house while her own family kept Christmas with less. You miss them, the Duke observed one evening, finding Eleanor standing by the window, watching snow fall. Every day, Eleanor admitted. I've never been away from them for Christmas before. I know I visited last week, I know they're managing, but it feels wrong to be here in all this luxury while they're at Ashworth with so little. Then we'll bring them here, the Duke said. Eleanor turned to stare at him. What? For Christmas? We'll send a carriage for your father and sister. They can stay here for the holiday. It's expected that I would want to meet my future family, and it will give you the chance to be with them. It was the kindest thing anyone had done for Eleanor in years. She felt tears prick her eyes. Thank you, she whispered. Your Grace, thank you. Alexander, he said quietly. If we're to be engaged, even falsely, you should use my given name, at least in private. Alexander, Eleanor repeated, testing the name. And you should call me Eleanor. Eleanor, he said, and something in the way he spoke her name made her shiver. They stood together by the window, watching snow fall over London, and Eleanor felt something dangerous bloom in her chest. Something that felt remarkably like hope, or perhaps something even more foolish. She was starting to care for him, for this complicated, wounded, guarded man who was trying so hard not to feel anything at all. And that, she knew, was the worst possible development in their already impossible situation. Her family arrived 3 days before Christmas. Eleanor waited in the entrance hall, barely able to contain her excitement, and when her father and Beatrice came through the doors, she ran to them with uncharacteristic abandon. Papa! B! Her father held her tight, and Eleanor felt tears on her cheeks. Lord Hartwell looked better than he had in months. Some of the weight lifted from his shoulders. The first payment of the Dowager's promise had reached him, Eleanor knew. Enough to satisfy immediate creditors and restore some security. Beatrice was radiant, her eyes wide as she took in the grandeur of Pemberton House. Ellie, she breathed, this is extraordinary. And you're truly engaged to a duke. It's complicated, Eleanor said quietly, aware of the listening servants. We'll talk later. The Duke appeared then, descending the stairs with his usual controlled grace. Eleanor watched her father stiffen, and watched Beatrice's eyes widen further. Lord Hartwell, Alexander said, bowing. Miss Beatrice, welcome to Pemberton House. I'm delighted to finally meet Eleanor's family. He played his role perfectly. The attentive fiancé, the gracious host, the aristocrat welcoming his future family. He asked Lord Hartwell about Ashworth Manor, discussed agricultural matters with surprising knowledge. He complimented Beatrice on her gown, putting her at ease with gentle humor. He was, Eleanor realized, making an effort for her benefit. That night, after her family had retired to their chambers, Eleanor found Alexander in his study. Thank you, she said from the doorway, for bringing them here, for being kind to them. Did you think I would be cruel? Alexander asked, looking up from his papers. I thought you might be indifferent, Eleanor admitted. But you weren't. You were genuinely welcoming. Why? Alexander set down his pen, regarding her steadily. Because they matter to you. And you. He paused, seeming to search for words. You matter to me. I'm not certain when that happened, Eleanor. But somewhere in these past weeks, you stopped being simply my mother's pawn or an inconvenient obligation. You became real. Eleanor's breath caught. Alexander. Don't, he said, but gently. Don't read more into it than exists. I'm simply acknowledging that I've come to respect you, to value your company. Nothing more. But it was more. Eleanor could feel it. In the way he looked at her, the way he'd softened almost imperceptibly over their weeks together. He was feeling something, even if he wouldn't name it, even if he was terrified to acknowledge it. And God help her, she was falling in love with him, with this stubborn, wounded man who was fighting so hard not to let anyone close. Christmas morning dawned bright and cold. The house was full of warmth and life, servants moving through corridors with purpose, the sense of roasted meat and sweet pastries filling the air. The Dowager Duchess had arranged a small gathering, family and close friends only, to celebrate. Eleanor dressed in a gown of deep green velvet, the richest thing she'd ever worn. When she descended for breakfast, she found Alexander waiting at the base of the stairs, and the way his eyes widened when he saw her made her pulse quicken. "You look," he began, then stopped. "Yes," Eleanor prompted. "Beautiful," he said finally. "You look beautiful, Eleanor." It was the first time he'd complimented her appearance without it being a performance for others. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Thank you. You look rather handsome yourself." "Rather handsome?" Alexander smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his face entirely, damning with faint praise. "I'm simply being English and understated," Eleanor teased. "Surely you appreciate that." "I appreciate many things about you," Alexander said, offering his arm. "Your restraint, your wit, your willingness to challenge me when I'm being insufferably arrogant." "That last one keeps me quite busy," Eleanor said, and was rewarded with his laugh, warm and real. They spent Christmas Day in surprising harmony. Opening gifts, Alexander had given Eleanor a set of watercolors with a note that said simply, "For when you remember who you were before," sharing the feast, playing games in the drawing room. Beatrice was shy but delighted. Lord Hartwell relaxed for the first time in years, and the Dowager Duchess looked at Eleanor and her son with an expression of such hope that Eleanor felt guilt twist in her chest. This wasn't real. This warmth, this family feeling, this growing connection. It was all built on deception. In 3 weeks, she and Alexander would stage their parting. This would end. That night, unable to sleep, Eleanor walked the corridors of Pemberton House. She ended up in the library, seeking the comfort of books. She found Alexander there, sitting by the fire with a volume of poetry he wasn't reading. "Can't sleep either?" he asked as she entered. "Too much rich food and excitement," Eleanor said, settling into the chair opposite him. "And too many thoughts. About endings," Eleanor admitted. "About how strange it will be to return to real life after this. About how your mother will be disappointed when we end the engagement as planned." "My mother orchestrated this situation," Alexander said. "She has no right to disappointment." "But she hoped," Eleanor said. "She hoped that somehow we would." She trailed off. "What? Fall in love?" Alexander's tone was carefully neutral. "Transform her fiction into reality?" "Yes, I'm aware that was her ultimate goal. She's not as subtle as she believes." "Would that be so terrible?" Eleanor asked quietly. "If we did care for each other?" Alexander was silent for a long moment, firelight playing across his features. "Eleanor," he said finally, his voice rough, Don't what? Don't hope for something that can't exist. I told you from the beginning, I don't believe in love. What I feel for you, this connection, it's likely nothing more than proximity and forced intimacy. A product of circumstance, not genuine feeling." "Are you trying to convince me or yourself?" Eleanor asked. "Both," Alexander admitted. "Because the alternative is too dangerous. The alternative is admitting that I'm starting to feel things I swore I never would again. And I can't, Eleanor. I can't survive being destroyed a second time." Eleanor's heart broke for him, for them both. "You don't know that I would destroy you." "I don't know that you wouldn't," Alexander said. "And I can't take that risk. Better to maintain our agreement. 6 weeks, then we parted as planned. It's safer for both of us." "Safer?" Eleanor repeated. But not happier. Safety and happiness are rarely compatible, Alexander said. I learned that lesson once. I won't forget it again. He rose, setting aside his book. Good night, Eleanor. Try to sleep. Tomorrow we have more obligations to fulfill. He left her sitting by the fire, her heart aching with loss for something they'd never quite allowed themselves to have. The week between Christmas and New Year passed in a blur of social obligations. Eleanor and Alexander attended parties and dinners, always together, always playing their roles. Eleanor grew skilled at reading his moods, at knowing when he needed rescue from tedious conversations, at providing the support he would never ask for. And Alexander, despite his protests about emotional distance, was unfailingly attentive, ensuring she always had refreshments, steering her away from the more vicious gossip, making certain she was comfortable and included. They were, Eleanor realized, becoming partners, learning each other's rhythms, anticipating each other's needs, building something real despite Alexander's determination to keep everything artificial. You're very good at this, Lady Thornberry observed at one soiree, watching Alexander fetch Eleanor a glass of champagne. Playing the loving couple. One almost believes it's genuine. Thank you, Eleanor said, her smile practiced. We try our best. But sometimes, in unguarded moments, it didn't feel like playing at all. New Year's Eve brought the 12th night ball, the final great celebration of the Christmas season. It was to be held at Pemberton House, a grand affair with hundreds of guests. The Dowager Duchess had spared no expense. The ballroom was transformed into a winter wonderland, all white and silver and crystal, with hundreds of candles making it glow like captured starlight. Eleanor dressed with particular care in a gown of white silk embroidered with silver thread. Her hair was arranged with tiny diamond pins that caught the light with every movement. She looked, even she had to admit, like something from a fairy tale. When she descended the stairs, Alexander was waiting, and the expression on his face made her breath catch. Eleanor, he said, his voice hoarse. You're rather handsome? She teased, trying to lighten the moment. Ethereal, he corrected. You look like something I don't deserve to touch. And yet you'll have to, Eleanor said. We have a ball to host, roles to play. Something flashed in Alexander's eyes. Pain, perhaps, or longing. Yes, roles to play. As always. The ball was magnificent. Eleanor and Alexander stood together receiving guests, accepting congratulations and good wishes. Eleanor danced until her feet ached, smiled until her face hurt, and all the while she was acutely aware of Alexander's presence, his hand at her waist during waltzes, his arms supporting her as they moved through the crowd. Near midnight, as the old year prepared to give way to the new, Alexander drew her onto the terrace. The winter air was cold but refreshing after the ballroom's heat. I wanted a moment alone with you, he said, before the new year begins. Why? Eleanor asked. Because in 2 weeks our arrangement ends. You'll return to your family, I'll return to my solitary existence, and this, he gestured between them. Whatever this is will be over. I wanted to tell you, while it's still the old year, while we're still bound in this fiction, I wanted to tell you that these weeks with you haven't been entirely unpleasant. Eleanor laughed despite the ache in her chest. What a ringing endorsement. Not entirely unpleasant. I shall treasure that forever. Eleanor, Alexander said, and there was something in his voice that made her look at him, really look at him. In the moonlight, his face was all angles and shadows, his eyes dark and intense. I need you to understand something. When we end this engagement, when you leave, you'll take something with you that I didn't think anyone could touch. You'll take the proof that I can still feel, that despite everything I've done to protect myself, I'm still capable of. He stopped, his jaw clenching. Of what? Eleanor whispered. Of wanting things I shouldn't want, Alexander said roughly. Of needing things that terrify me. Of caring about someone more than is safe or wise or remotely practical. Alexander, don't say anything, he interrupted. Please, just let me have this moment of honesty before we go back inside and resume our performance. Let me tell you that if circumstances were different, if I were different, If I believed love was anything more than beautiful lies and eventual betrayal, I would. He broke off. But I don't believe it. And I am who I am. And in 2 weeks, this ends as planned. He turned to go back inside, but Eleanor caught his arm. What if I don't want it to end? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander looked at her, and in his eyes she saw such conflict, such yearning warring with such fear, that it nearly broke her. What we want and what's wise are rarely the same thing, he said. I learned that lesson. Don't make me teach it to you as well. He left her on the terrace, and Eleanor stood alone in the cold, watching her breath mist in the air, feeling something precious slipping through her fingers like water. Inside, the bells rang midnight. The new year had begun, and Eleanor knew with sinking certainty that she had fallen completely, hopelessly in love with a man who was too broken to let himself love her back. The first week of January brought unseasonably cold weather. Snow fell heavily, blanketing London in white, making travel difficult. Eleanor's family had returned to Ashworth after New Year, and the house felt emptier without them. Or perhaps it felt empty because the end of her arrangement with Alexander was approaching, and both of them were pulling back, rebuilding walls in preparation for parting. They were polite to each other, carefully, painfully polite. They attended fewer events, using the weather as an excuse. They had meals together, but conversation was stilted. The ease they'd built over the past weeks was crumbling, replaced by the awkwardness of two people bracing for goodbye. 1 week remains, the Dowager Duchess observed one morning at breakfast. Have you and Alexander discussed how you'll stage the dissolution? Not yet, Eleanor said. But we should. It needs to be done carefully to minimize scandal. Does it need to be done at all? The Dowager Duchess asked quietly. Eleanor met her eyes, seeing the hope there, the plea. Your Grace, Eleanor said gently. Your son has made his feelings clear. He doesn't believe in love. He views our connection as nothing more than proximity and obligation. I won't force myself on a man who doesn't want me, no matter how much you wish otherwise. He does want you, the Dowager Duchess insisted. He's simply too stubborn and frightened to admit it. Eleanor, I've known my son his entire life. I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you. He's feeling something real, even if he won't name it. Feeling something and choosing to act on it are different things, Eleanor said. Alexander has chosen, and I must respect that choice, even if it breaks my heart. That afternoon, Eleanor sought Alexander out in his study. They needed to plan the end of the charade, painful as that would be. She found him at his desk, surrounded by papers, but he wasn't working. He was simply sitting, staring at nothing, his expression bleak. Alexander, Eleanor said softly, are you all right? He looked up, and for a moment his mask slipped. She saw exhaustion in his face, and something that looked like despair. No, he said simply. I'm not all right, Eleanor. But I will be once this is finished. The words stung as they were perhaps meant to. Eleanor moved into the room, closing the door behind her. We should discuss how to end this, she said. Plan what we'll say, how we'll explain it to society. Mutual decision, Alexander said flatly. Discovered we didn't suit. Standard language for broken engagements. It will cause talk, but it will fade eventually. These things always do. Very practical, Eleanor said, her throat tight. I am nothing if not practical, Alexander replied. It's served me well. Has it? Eleanor challenged. Has your practicality made you happy, Alexander? Has surrounding yourself with walls and refusing to feel anything made your life better? It's made my life safer, Alexander shot back. That's enough. Is it? Eleanor moved closer, her heart hammering. Because you look miserable. You've looked miserable for weeks, fighting what you feel, denying what's between us. When does safety become prison, Alexander? When does protecting yourself become the very thing that destroys you? Don't, Alexander said, standing abruptly. Don't do this, Eleanor. Don't make this harder than it already is. Why shouldn't I make it hard? Eleanor demanded, her own emotions finally breaking through careful control. Why should I make it easy for you to throw away something real because you're too frightened to trust it? I love you, Alexander. I love your intelligence and your dedication and even your stubborn refusal to admit you feel anything. I love the man beneath the armor, the one who brought my family here for Christmas, who gave me watercolors because he remembered I used to paint, who looks at me sometimes like I'm the answer to a question he's afraid to ask. I love you, and I think you love me too, and I'm done pretending otherwise. The silence that followed was crushing. Alexander stared at her, his face pale, his eyes wide with something that looked like panic. You can't love me, he said finally. You don't know what you're saying. I know exactly what I'm saying, Eleanor insisted. And I know what you're feeling, even if you won't admit it. You're terrified. I understand. Caroline hurt you, taught you not to trust. But I'm not Caroline Alexander. I'm not going to betray you or leave you or use you. I'm just a woman who loves you and wants a chance to build something real with you. Real, Alexander repeated, his voice hollow. Nothing about this has been real, Eleanor. It's all been fiction, performance, my mother's elaborate scheme. How can you claim to love me when everything between us has been based on lies? The engagement was a lie, Eleanor agreed. But what I feel for you is real. What I see in your eyes when you think I'm not looking is real. The connection we've built, the partnership, the way we've learned from each other, that's all real, Alexander, and you know it. He turned away from her, his shoulders rigid with tension. It doesn't matter what I feel or don't feel. I made a decision 5 years ago. I decided that emotional vulnerability was a weakness I couldn't afford. I've lived by that decision, built my entire life around it. I'm not going to abandon it now because of a few weeks of proximity and a pretty speech about love. So that's it. Eleanor felt tears burning her eyes but refused to let them fall. You're just going to let me walk away? Let us both walk away from something that could make us happy. Happy is overrated, Alexander said, his voice hard. Safe is better. Controlling is better. I don't need happiness, Eleanor. I need certainty, stability, the knowledge that I won't be destroyed again. You're already destroying yourself, Eleanor said quietly. You're so busy protecting your heart that you've forgotten what it feels like to actually have one. She waited for him to respond, to argue, to give her any sign that her words had affected him. But he remained turned away, silent and immovable as stone. Very well, Eleanor said, her voice breaking despite her efforts to stay composed. We'll end this as planned. I'll play my part one final time. But Alexander, know this? I don't regret falling in love with you. I don't regret caring about you, trying to reach you, hoping you might let yourself feel something real. The only thing I regret is that you're too frightened to do the same. She left him standing in his study, walked blindly to her chamber, and finally let the tears come. She had known this would hurt. She had known from the beginning that loving Alexander was dangerous. But she hadn't quite anticipated how much it would break her to offer him her heart and watch him refuse it out of fear. That evening, Eleanor did not come down to dinner. A maid brought word that she was unwell, suffering from headache and fatigue. Alexander sat alone at the enormous dining table, forcing food past the tightness in his throat, and felt the emptiness of the house settle over him like a shroud. This was what he'd wanted, he reminded himself. This was the plan. End the engagement, return to his solitary existence, eliminate the risk and vulnerability that Eleanor represented. So why did it feel like he was tearing out his own heart? You're a fool, his mother said from the doorway. He hadn't heard her enter. I'm practical, Alexander corrected. There's a difference. No, darling. The Dowager Duchess moved into the room, her expression more serious than he'd ever seen it. You're a fool. A stubborn, frightened fool who is about to make the greatest mistake of your life. I don't need a lecture, Mother, Alexander said wearily. Yes, you do. You need someone to tell you that what Caroline did to you 5 years ago was cruel and wrong, but it doesn't define your entire future. You need someone to point out that Eleanor is nothing like Caroline, that she's spent these past weeks proving herself in every way that matters. You need someone to remind you that love isn't weakness. It's the only thing that makes this cold, difficult life worth living. You don't understand, Alexander said. I understand perfectly. His mother sat across from him, her eyes blazing with intensity. I understand that after your father died, I was broken, devastated. I thought I would never recover from losing him. And do you know what got me through it? The memory of loving him, the years we had together, the knowledge that I had chosen to be vulnerable with him, to give him my heart, and that even though it hurt when he was gone, I wouldn't trade a moment of what we shared. That's different, Alexander protested. Father didn't betray you. No, he died and left me alone for 20 years. In some ways, that's worse. But I don't regret loving him, Alexander. I don't regret being vulnerable. And if I had the choice to do it again, knowing how it would end, I would choose him every time. Because the alternative, living without love, without connection, without allowing anyone close, that's not safety, darling. That's just slow death. Alexander felt something crack inside him, some wall he'd maintained for so long beginning to crumble. I'm afraid, he admitted, the words costing him everything. I'm terrified, Mother. What if I let myself love her and she leaves? What if I give her everything and it's not enough? What if you love her and she stays? His mother interrupted gently. What if you give her everything and she gives you everything back? What if, for once in your life since Caroline, you choose hope over fear? What if you let yourself be happy, Alexander? I don't know if I remember how, he said, his voice raw. Then let Eleanor teach you, his mother said. She loves you, really truly loves you. Not your title, not your wealth, not what you can provide. She loves you, the complicated, stubborn, occasionally insufferable man beneath the ducal armor. Don't throw that away because you're afraid. Be brave enough to reach for what you want. After his mother left, Alexander sat alone in the dining room for a long time, wrestling with decades of self-protection and the terrifying possibility of hope. Eleanor loved him. She'd said it plainly, offered her heart without reservation or calculation. And what had he done? Rejected her, hurt her, chosen safety over the possibility of something real. He'd been a coward. Alexander rose from the table, a decision crystallizing in his mind. He'd spent 5 years hiding from feeling, convincing himself that emotional distance was strength. But sitting here alone, knowing Eleanor was somewhere in his house crying because he'd been too frightened to accept what she offered, he realized his mother was right. This wasn't strength. This was a slow death, and he was done dying. The next morning, Eleanor woke to find a note slipped under her door. Alexander's handwriting, bold and precise. Please meet me in the music room at noon. There is something I need to show you. Eleanor's heart hammered as she dressed and made her way through the house. She found the music room's doors closed, and from within came the unexpected sound of piano music. Hesitantly, she opened the door. Alexander sat at the piano, his back to her, playing something beautiful and melancholy. He was, Eleanor realized with shock, exceptionally skilled. The music filled the room, speaking of longing and regret and something that might have been hope. When the piece ended, he sat with his hands on the keys for a long moment before turning to face her. My father taught me, he said quietly. Before he died, music was his passion. After he was gone, I stopped playing. It reminded me too much of loss, of what it felt like to love someone and have them taken away. For 15 years, I haven't touched these keys. Why now? Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Because you were right, Alexander said, rising and moving toward her. About all of it. I've been destroying myself slowly, brick by brick, building walls so high that no one could reach me. I thought I was protecting myself, but I was just disappearing, becoming less, until you came into my life and reminded me what it felt like to be real. Eleanor felt tears starting in her eyes but didn't try to stop them. When you said you loved me yesterday, Alexander continued, his own voice thick with emotion, when you offered me your heart so fearlessly, I wanted desperately to say it back, to tell you that somewhere in these weeks together, you'd become essential to me, that I think about you constantly, that your happiness matters more than my own, that the thought of you leaving tears me apart. I wanted to say all of that, but I was terrified. So I hid behind practicality and pushed you away. And now, Eleanor whispered. Now I'm trying to be brave, Alexander said. To choose hope over fear. To be the man I was before Caroline broke me, or perhaps an even better version. A man who's learned from pain but isn't defined by it. A man who's worthy of the extraordinary woman standing before me. He took her hands in his, and Eleanor felt the tremor in his fingers, saw the vulnerability in his eyes. Eleanor Hartwell, he said, I love you, not because of proximity or obligation or my mother's schemes. I love you because you're brilliant and brave and kind, because you challenged me to be better when it would have been easier to simply play along. Because you saw through every wall I built and cared about the broken man behind them. I love you, and I'm asking, not as part of a fiction, not as performance. I'm asking genuinely, will you marry me? Will you give me the chance to spend my life proving that I'm worth the risk you'd be taking? Eleanor was crying openly now, tears of joy streaming down her face. Yes, she said, laughing and crying at once. Yes, Alexander, I'll marry you. Not because your mother schemed or because my family needs money. I'll marry you because I love you, because these past weeks with you have been the happiest of my life, even when they were difficult. Because I want to build a real life with you, full of music and laughter and all the messy, complicated feelings you've been avoiding. Alexander pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. His own face was wet, she realized. The Duke of Pemberton, who never showed emotion, was crying. I'm going to be terrible at this, he warned, his voice muffled against her hair. At being vulnerable and open and all the things that real love requires. I've spent 5 years doing the opposite. I'll forget. I'll retreat. I'll need you to pull me back when I start building walls again. I can do that, Eleanor said. I'm exceptionally good at tearing down your walls. I've had practice. He laughed, a sound of pure joy, and then he was kissing her. Not the careful, performative kisses they'd shared for society. This was real. Desperate and tender and full of all the emotion he'd been holding back. Eleanor kissed him back with equal fervor, pouring 5 weeks of longing and hope into the embrace. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Alexander rested his forehead against hers. We should probably tell my mother, he said. She'll be insufferably smug about this. She orchestrated the entire thing, Eleanor pointed out. She deserves to be smug. Don't tell her that. She'll spend the rest of her life scheming to manipulate our children. Our children, Eleanor repeated, warmth flooding through her at the words. I like the sound of that. So do I, Alexander admitted. Though perhaps we should actually get married first. When? Eleanor asked. Tomorrow, if you'd agree to it, Alexander said. I've wasted 5 years being afraid. I don't want to waste another moment. Your mother will be disappointed if she doesn't get to plan a grand wedding, Eleanor said. My mother can plan whatever celebration she wants afterward, Alexander replied. But I want to marry you as soon as possible. Small ceremony, just family, and then the rest of our lives together. Does that sound acceptable? It sounds perfect, Eleanor said. They found the Dowager Duchess in the morning room, reviewing correspondence. She looked up as they entered together, hand in hand, and her face transformed with joy. I take it you've resolved your differences? She asked, though her smile suggested she already knew. We're getting married, Alexander announced. Actually married. Tomorrow, if Eleanor agrees. Tomorrow. The Dowager Duchess's eyes widened. Alexander, that's hardly enough time to. Tomorrow, Alexander repeated firmly. We've wasted enough time already. We're not wasting any more. His mother looked between them, seeing the love plainly visible on both faces, and her expression softened. Very well, she said. Tomorrow, I'll make the arrangements. It will have to be small, just family and closest friends. But we'll make it beautiful. It will be perfect, Eleanor said. Thank you, Your Grace, for everything, for bringing us together, even though your methods were somewhat questionable. Questionable? The Dowager Duchess laughed. My dear girl, my methods were outrageous. But I saw something in both of you. Two lonely people, both convinced they were better off alone. I simply gave you the opportunity to discover otherwise. You gave us much more than that, Alexander said quietly, moving to embrace his mother. You gave me my life back. I don't think I'd fully realized how much I'd lost until Eleanor helped me find it again. The Dowager Duchess held her son tight, tears in her eyes. I just wanted you to be happy, darling. That's all I've ever wanted. The wedding took place the next afternoon in the chapel at Pemberton House. It was snowing softly, making the world outside the windows look like something from a dream. Eleanor wore a gown of ivory silk, not the elaborate creation from the Christmas ball, but something simpler and more beautiful. Beatrice and Lord Hartwell stood as witnesses, both of them crying openly. The Dowager Duchess watched from the front pew, her face radiant with satisfaction and joy. A small handful of close friends filled the remaining seats, but Eleanor barely noticed any of them. Her entire focus was on Alexander, standing before her in his finest coat, his eyes never leaving her face. When he spoke his vows, his voice was steady and sure, and Eleanor heard in every word the truth of his feelings. I, Alexander Edmund Winters, take you, Eleanor Rose Hartwell, to be my wife. I promise to love you not from duty or obligation, but from choice, freely, fully, for all the days of my life. I promise to be worthy of the gift you're giving me, to honor your trust, and to never take your presence in my life for granted. I promise to be brave enough to feel, to be vulnerable enough to truly love you as you deserve. Eleanor's own voice shook as she spoke her vows. I, Eleanor Rose Hartwell, take you, Alexander Edmund Winters, to be my husband. I promise to love you through joy and difficulty, through certainty and doubt. I promise to remind you, when you forget, that feeling is strength, not weakness. I promise to challenge you, support you, and stand beside you in all things. And I promise that you will never again have to face the world alone. When the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, Alexander cupped her face in his hands and kissed her with such tenderness that Eleanor felt tears spill over. I love you, he whispered against her lips. Thank you for being brave enough to love me first. Thank you for being brave enough to love me back, Eleanor replied. The small wedding breakfast that followed was filled with laughter and joy. Lord Hartwell toasted his new son-in-law with obvious emotion. Beatrice declared it the most romantic thing she'd ever witnessed. The Dowager Duchess made a speech about faith and hope and trusting that sometimes the most unlikely paths lead to the most perfect destinations. As the afternoon faded into evening and guests began to depart, Alexander drew Eleanor into his study. Their study now, she realized with a thrill. Happy? He asked, pulling her into his arms. Extraordinarily so, Eleanor said. Though I keep expecting to wake up and discover this was all a dream. If it is, I'm dreaming of it too, Alexander said. Which seems unlikely, but I suppose mathematically possible. Eleanor laughed. Leave it to you to bring mathematics into our wedding night. Our wedding night, Alexander repeated, his eyes darkening. Are you nervous? A little, Eleanor admitted. Are you? Terrified, he said honestly, but also certain. This is right, Eleanor. You and me. This life we're beginning. I've never been more certain of anything. Then let's begin it properly, Eleanor said, rising on her toes to kiss him. What followed was tender and occasionally awkward. Neither of them had significant experience, but also profound and beautiful. Alexander was careful with her, attentive, making sure she felt cherished and safe. And Eleanor gave herself to him completely, holding nothing back, and felt him do the same. Afterward, lying together in the enormous bed that was now theirs to share, Eleanor traced patterns on Alexander's chest while he stroked her hair. I have a confession, he said quietly. Another one? Eleanor teased. You're full of confessions today. This one is important. He tilted her chin up so he could see her face. I knew my mother was planning something. Not the specifics, but I knew she was scheming. I told myself I would stop her when I discovered what it was. Eleanor's eyes widened. You knew. I suspected, Alexander clarified. And when you appeared at that ball, when my mother made her announcement, part of me was furious. But another part. He paused. Another part was relieved, because it gave me an excuse to spend time with you, to know you while maintaining emotional distance. I could tell myself I was simply managing the situation, not actually developing feelings. But I was lying to myself from the beginning, Eleanor. I started falling for you that very first night, when you stood before me in silver silk and fury, and defended your choices instead of apologizing for them. Why didn't you say something sooner? Eleanor asked. Because I'm a coward, Alexander said simply. Because loving you meant risking everything I'd built to protect myself. It took nearly losing you to make me understand that the risk was worth it, that loving you was worth any price. I'm glad your mother schemes, Eleanor said. Otherwise, I never would have met you. I'm glad you were desperate enough to agree to her mad plan, Alexander replied. Otherwise, I'd still be alone in this house, convincing myself I was perfectly content with isolation. They fell asleep wrapped around each other, and Eleanor thought that nothing had ever felt so perfectly right. 5 years later, the Christmas ball at Pemberton House was in full swing. Eleanor moved through the crowd, greeting guests with the grace and confidence of a woman who had truly become Duchess of Pemberton. Her emerald silk gown was exquisite, but the most beautiful thing about her was the happiness that radiated from her very being. She was looking for her husband, who had disappeared half an hour ago with their 3-year-old daughter, Catherine, claiming she needed rescuing from the nursery. Eleanor found them in the music room. Alexander sat at the piano, Catherine on his lap, teaching her to pick out a simple melody with one small finger while her dark curls bounced with concentration. Like this, sweetheart, Alexander said gently, guiding her hand. Gentle. Music responds to gentleness. Mama, Catherine shrieked, abandoning the piano to run to Eleanor. I'm playing music like Papa. I heard, Eleanor said, scooping up her daughter. You're very talented. She has your musical ear, Alexander said, rising and moving to embrace them both. And my stubborn determination. We're doomed. Eleanor laughed, leaning into him. Their son Thomas, barely a year old, was asleep in the nursery under the watchful eye of his nurse. Their family was small but perfect, and growing more perfect every day. We should return to the ball, Eleanor said. People will talk if both the Duke and Duchess disappear. Let them talk, Alexander said. But he followed her anyway, Catherine balanced on his hip. They paused at the top of the stairs, looking down at the glittering ballroom below. 5 years ago, Eleanor had descended these same stairs as a terrified imposter, about to participate in a deception that had nearly destroyed them both. Now she descended as Alexander's true wife, his partner, his love. Regrets, Alexander murmured, reading her thoughts as he so often did. Not a single one, Eleanor said. Even the lies that brought us together, I don't regret those, because they led to this, to us. To us, Alexander agreed, though I maintain my mother's methods were unconscionable. Your mother's methods were perfect, the Dowager Duchess said from behind them, making them both jump. She swept past, resplendent in purple silk, grinning unrepentantly. I brought you two together and gave you this beautiful life. A little gratitude wouldn't be amiss. We named our son after you, Alexander pointed out. Thomas Alexander, the Dowager Duchess said. Yes, very sweet. Now give me that granddaughter and go dance with your wife. Show these young people what real love looks like. She swept away with Catherine, leaving Alexander and Eleanor alone at the top of the stairs. Shall we? Alexander offered his arm with exaggerated formality. My beautiful wife, will you do me the honor of this dance? I thought you'd never ask, Eleanor said, and together they descended into the ball, into the life they'd built, into the love that had survived deception and fear and transformed them both. And in the ballroom below, the orchestra began to play.